Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. We welcome you to the Kleinman Center. I'm Angela Pachon, the Research Director of the Kleinman Center. We are today thrilled to be part of Climate Week at Penn with this lecture. And I think to introduce, how it's gonna work today. We are gonna have a presentation and with moderate question by Nick Besner. And then there's gonna be a Q&A. But let's talk about the topic, because to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need negative economy-wide decarbonization in combination with atmospheric carbon removal at the billion-ton scale. This is massive. And so these efforts will require unprecedented management of carbon dioxide through strategic technical deployment and infrastructure build out. Today, we have the privilege of hearing the latest research on this topic from Psarras, a research assistant professor in chemical and biomolecular engineering at the School of Engineering. And he's also associated with the Kleinman Center, while our faculty member, Jennifer Wilcox, is taking a leave of work at the Department of Energy. Pete is leading the work at the Clean Energy Conversion Lab. So in today's presentation, Pete explores challenges and opportunities in carbon management, illustrating how various impact layers from the techno-economic, social, and environmental perspectives interact from a new picture of deployment. And he will talk about this very interesting project that they are currently undertaking with the Nature Conservancy in the state of Nevada. So moderating this conversation is Kleinman Center faculty fellow and assistant professor of landscape architecture at the Weissman School of Design, Nick Besner. So without further ado, Pete, please come. Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Well, thanks for coming. This is an important topic to me. I'm Pete Psarras. I do some research at the Clean Energy Conversion Lab here at Penn. We focus on really the engineered side of carbon management. We respect all forms of carbon management. So we're going to talk today about some of the observations we've had, how we've approached the problem historically, and how we think the best way to move forward looks like. I usually don't do a time check right off the bat, but I think we should start with a time check. We've got 28 years left to 2050. Maybe it's an arbitrary number, but you're going to hear a lot of claims and pledges relative to mid-century. It's 28 years out. 28 years ago, I was hitting my awkward peak in high school, right? So it wasn't that long ago. We've emitted 2,400 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere since the industrial age, and really 400 of that occurred in almost the last 10 years, a significant amount, and record pace really. If you look at a figure from the IPCC, you'll recognize that we have a carbon budget. And that carbon budget is dedicated to understanding how we can avoid the worst effects of climate change and these impacts, right? So if we want to stay below 1.5 C, 50% shot of doing that, we've got about 500 billion tons left in that budget. A little over twice that if we want to shoot for 2 degrees C, right? And you'll note, and you may have heard why some have put us on the clock, and we have about 12 years left. Well, if we're at that pace, that's exactly what that pencils out to, right? Well, that is carbon management. Okay, how do we manage 400 billion tons of CO2 and redirect from the atmosphere to buy us some time here? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. It's a tremendous scale, and we're under a time crunch. Neither one of those things necessarily leads to responsible and careful treading, but that's also the challenge that is in front of us. Where do these emissions come from, right? A number of sources. And so again, the challenge is that scale, right, to mitigate everything below that curve. Fortunately, the solution space is robust, and I'm going to talk about 3 pillars today. Right, that first pillar, and that first pillar should come first, is reductions. Right, deep economy-wide reductions of carbon dioxide through many of the technologies that we're all well aware of and that are in place. Energy efficiency, transitioning to low carbon sources of fuel. Right, we understand that this should come first, and that should, as you know, should take the lion's share of that mitigation portfolio. We're talking about not creating greenhouse gases molecules in the first place, right? And there are many ways to do that, and there's innovative ways to do that going forward. What we can't reduce, we should think about avoiding, right? If we have to generate that carbon dioxide, perhaps from technical, social, or other reasons, right? We should look at not releasing that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is where technologies like carbon capture and storage come into play. I think that's an appropriate use of carbon capture when you go through that reduction scheme and look at those hard debate residuals that remain. After that, and that third pillar, and it's one of our focus, and you're seeing a lot of that today, is carbon dioxide removal, right? If avoidance is pre-release capture, okay, at that point source, removal is post-release capture. It's already been in the atmosphere. We can take it right back out, and there are a number of ways to do that. We'll talk about some of those today. The problem with this picture in the removal space is that removal can be used, and it is sort of being treated today as sort of a panacea to all 3. It can cover everything under that curve. And unless I be immediately taken out of horrible context, I want to go on record for saying that's a terrible idea to do that, right? And so some would argue that we have our priorities out of alignment when we're talking about removal today. But there's a very key reason why we need to talk about removal today. And that is we have to hit that scale mark, right? 26% growth rate. This is a decade-on-decade growth of about an order of magnitude. That's what that works out to. There are not a lot of technologies that have been able to sustain that for that period of time. Solar is one of them, okay? We're gonna have to repeat that here. That's assuming that we were at 1 million tons of carbon removal in 2020, and sadly, we were not at 1 million ton scale in 2020. You can see there, that's a picture of Kleinworks' Orca facility. It came out about this time last year. It takes 4,000 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere per year. That's the largest commercial facility in the world for direct air capture. And to hit a gigaton scale by mid-century, we need to install one of these every hour on the hour between now and then. So it's a tremendous feat, and we need to think about how to do that responsibly, which is why it's so key to get those first 2 pillars correct. And so you kind of get into that step 1 here, right? Reductions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. This isn't a focus of our group and our research, but we certainly understand how these technologies interact with what we do, right? So electrification across the economy can reduce emissions in several cases, switching to low carbon electricity sources. We understand that these are all relevant. We're seeing some governments now installing very strict guidelines in terms of electric vehicles and heat pumps in homes, and we're seeing that, and that's a welcome effort in doing this aggressively, again, to take that huge share so we can reduce the burden on other technologies like CCS and CDR. Right. Department of Energy recently released a roadmap for decarbonizing the industrial sector, which is a humongous sector. If you take into account indirect emissions from electricity usage, it is the largest contributor to greenhouse gases, at least in the United States. And you can see some of those reduction technologies there. We can see fuel switching and low carbon fuels and hydrogen. We can see energy efficiency, which obviously these facilities and industries have been implementing for years and decades, because that's also a cost saving scheme. Industrial electrification is enormous, particularly in terms of industrial heat. So perhaps creating steam from heat pumps, okay, and low carbon electricity sources. And then you see here, this kind of 4th pillar, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Now, why is this so important in industrial sector? Now, I want to apologize first for two reasons. One, for the chemistry, and some of your averse, and also the small side here. The take-home message here is the right-hand side of those reactions, right? This is product CO2. This is a reactionary byproduct of many of the commodities that are so vital, all right, to our society, and that will be called upon in terms of economic and population growth over the next few decades, right? These are reactionary byproducts, which means fuel switching can't touch these, right? And energy efficiency can't touch these. So what do you do about it? In the absence of green analogs to these processes and materials that don't emit that carbon dioxide, perhaps we need to start looking at avoiding, right? Pre-release capture of that carbon dioxide. Another reason why that might be relevant, and I think it's an appropriate application of carbon capture and storage to these types of problems that can't be addressed through other mechanisms, has to do with the Sherwood relationship. The Sherwood Principle it's a simple engineering principle that originally related the cost of minerals to their dilution in Earth's mineable crust, and there's an inverse relationship there, and that makes sense to me. The more dilute that material, the more unwanted material you need to process, more energy and cost you put into that, right? So it's very similar in terms of efficiency of capture, right? And so what you'll find is through the generation of process emissions and that reactionary byproduct CO2, you can have higher concentration of CO2 at the source, which leads to more efficient capture, right? It's also why you want to get it at the source and not emit it to the atmosphere and take it back. Because of that dilution, you're looking at 20, 30%, even much higher purity at the source versus 0.04% in the atmosphere, right? So get it there if at all possible. So you can take something like this, and we've done this analysis and research, and you can take it and develop a techno-economic picture of carbon capture, right, and deployment. We know where these facilities are, they're point sources, right? We can characterize them. They report their greenhouse gas emissions annually. And so we know what their volumes are like. We know the chemistry, so we have a good sense of what their emission profiles look like. Right? And we can develop a cost model. And this is really was the impetus for our research over the last decade, when everybody pointed the finger back at us and said, CCS is way too expensive to be deployed today. And we say, I'll see that, and I'll raise you a marginal abatement curve, right? That will show you where potentially where to start, right? And then no secret. So you've got very pure streams like bioethanol, right off the bat, other pure streams, ammonia, hydrogen, et cetera. That could be, right? You're developing a merit order of how to approach an industrial sector. The kicker for us, and where we've started to place a lot of our focus, is what happens when you actually and honestly consider transportation and storage costs. Transportation and storage has historically been a slap-on, $20 more or less, and we find not so, right? I think you recall there were geographical distinctions in those point sources, right? Getting that CO2 responsibly to its end source in a geological storage site can be not only very, very cost intensive, but we also recognize that there's where a lot of the societal environmental impact lies, right? So there's a mutual benefit here in recognizing opportunities where these overlap, because it's not only cost saving, but you can minimize the impact of downstream carbon management. It goes without saying that the industrial sector is incredibly diverse and complicated. These are actually two probably of the simpler schemes, cement and steel production. Look at more complicated industries like refining. Some of the largest facilities have over 200 points of carbon emission in those facilities, and really only a few of them have those process emissions that we'd be looking for economic capture. So the CCS can apply here, right? It's still very new, and we recognize that it may not be able to get all, and that's where we run into those hard to abate residuals, which should bring us to pillar 3 in carbon dioxide removal. And I always make a point in these talks to leave this last, but again, we come back to the idea of why do we need to talk about it today? And again, it's that scale. So we recognize really 3 roles of carbon dioxide removal. 1 is lowering emissions today in the near term. 2 is to counterbalance those hard to abate residuals. And then in the long term, right? We're only going to be able to stabilize temperature if we're deploying carbon removal in excess of our emissions and our residuals toward the end of the century. So there's a very vast solution space here as well. They've often been categorized into nature-based solutions and engineered solutions. I very much dislike that because it kind of casts them up and you start to think that you need to stand in one camp or the other. I think they're all valuable. Every one of those solutions has its own unique benefit and risk profile that is frankly complemented by another solution. So they don't necessarily work well in silos and in isolation, but rather in tandem. Our focus is on the right side: direct air capture, enhanced weathering, no favoritism is just what we do. Right? We have a lot of friends in regenerative agriculture, a lot looking at oceans. There are monitoring and verification questions that could potentially be bottlenecks in the deployment and the acceleration of these technologies that need a lot of attention, RD&D as well. Okay. But whatever your flavor, we think they should abide by a number of governing principles in terms of quality. And I'd like to talk through 5 of those. The first is really key, and this is additionality and baselines. Okay, this is the idea that when we assess the amount of removal that we'll need, we're really talking about incremental, right? Incremental. There is a tremendous amount of flux of CO2 into and out of subsystems on an annual basis, way more than we'll be handling at that scale. So the key is understanding what is already occurring without our intervention. What do we add to that removal, which is, again, what we're tasked with as a result of carbon removal projects. An example would be if I were to claim to protect a forest that was in fact in no danger in the first place, right? Have I really done anything to increase carbon uptake? Now, if I'm just saying that, that's one thing. If I'm going to a verification body to get those carbon offset credits verified, and I'm selling those to a corporation who wants to apply them against their own carbon balance, that's a very different thing. And so we have to be very careful about how we establish those baselines and additional carbon removal on top of that. The second is durability. Projects should be highly durable. This describes how long we're keeping that carbon dioxide sequestered out of the atmosphere. And that can vary significantly based on the solution that you're looking at, right? 100 years is a good target. That target used to be, even 5, 6, 7 years, at 10,000, it was geological timescales or bust. I have no idea where I'm going to be in 5, probably hours. I don't know where we'll be in 100 years. I hope we're well on our way out of this mess. Certainly 10,000 years. But the point being is that we need to think about establishing technologies that keep that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for a long period of time, or we need to understand exactly what the risk is for reversal, right? Because if we're doing that accounting and we're applying some of those as net removals against our carbon budget, and they then re-emit in the latter half of the century, then we need to be able to make sure that we're being very careful about that accounting. Leakage is another thing that we will want to watch for in terms of carbon dioxide removal deployment. This isn't leakage out of storage reservoirs, this is economic leakage. So in the application of your project, are you inducing emissions elsewhere? Again, if I were a logger and I promised not to cut down a forest for 20 or 30 years longer than I had anticipated, you can calculate the increased biomass in terms of the uptake in that forest, in terms of increased storage in a non-atmospheric subsystem. But if, as a result of that, and as a result of markets and demand for timber, I decided to start and create a foresting project to replace that lumber that I lost in that project, then I have just shifted those emissions elsewhere. So really important to be mindful of leakage. All of these kind of feed into carbon accounting, and I talked a little bit about MRV, right? Monitoring, reporting, and verification. We need to ensure that we have good models that predict and understand not just the carbon storage in these subsystems and these projects, that we're able to monitor those over long periods of time, particularly if we're stating that carbon will be storable. And then, of course, we have to be transparent about uncertainty in those models. And finally, and I should go without saying, do no harm, right? And I think this is why we're all here today. These projects, and again, at the scale that we need to deploy, we need to be extra diligent to make sure that we're not imparting harms on the communities, particularly that are disadvantaged. All right, so we kind of get into this idea of where should we replace or should we place CDR projects? I think the question or the answer to that from us historically has been, well, where is it technically and economically feasible? Those were those techno-economic models. Kevin, of course, the talk is beyond techno-economics. So we recognize that there's an additional layer there, complexity. Where are they also socially, environmentally acceptable? And we can use direct air capture as sort of a proxy to kind of take us on this journey. We've got two really prevailing commercial options. There are a number of emerging ones. I should plug Heirloom that came out of our lab. Go Noah. But you have a sorbent-based system on light. That's that Orca plant that I referenced earlier, 4,000 tons. You have a very large plant, at least conceptually drawn carbon engineering's technology that will be 500,000 tons with a capacity to hit 1 million tons in the Permian. So a very large facility. We're really excited to see what that looks like. You can see a lot of the specs kind of converge, maybe outside of water usage. But the one that really gets us is this energy, right? It's a very energy intensive. It goes back to the Sherwood, such a dilute source. You've got to move such a tremendous amount of air to hit your mass requirements, right? So there have been a lot of approaches to how do we reduce this and that burden on the energy sector as we go forward. Our lab considered, why not pair it with geothermal? Could this be the next peanut butter and jelly here? I don't know. We know that there's at least one DAC technology that operates in the temperature regime that that we find geothermal brines, and so there could be a way to configure and integrate these. And I know it may not be obvious from our block flow diagram here, but we're placing that DAG plant in such a way that at least it minimizes or completely eliminates any loss in generation potential, right? Those geothermal plants are obviously producing low carbon electricity to the grid, right? And not only we want to ensure that that goes there, but if we were to rob those electrons from the grid, we'd have to actually account for them elsewhere, right? Which undermines the kind of the whole idea in terms of kind of carbon abatement. So you could take something like this and again, go out and seek, well, where are the optimal geothermal resources? And you can see from we have a lot of that prospecting. A lot of that is out west. That's where the geothermal plants in the United States are. Okay, and you can go from that kind of picture to this, a techno-economic picture of DAC deployment. And this was a study in 2020 where we considered not only geothermal, we also looked at a slipstream from nuclear and how those low carbon thermal streams can pair with direct air capture. And again, much like our other techno-economic picture, we saw very large spans of costs as a result of the transport and storage, right? One of the reasons here, which may not be obvious, is that geothermal and geological reservoirs don't really co-align well. We think we might have a solution to that in pairing that CO2 with mine tailings, which might have the proper alkalinity to store that CO2 in carbonate form right then and there. And there is a lot of mining activity where you'll find these geothermal resources, which is part of why we focused on Nevada. And I'll get to that at the end of the discussion. But the key here is really kind of from that 10,000-foot view, it's a little bit challenging to understand how to proceed. We'd like to zoom in a little bit. This is part of that analysis, but a separate study that we did for Lawrence Livermore that looked at the Salton Sea region in Southern California. Salton Sea is a hotbed of geothermal activity. It's also has some prominent lithium extraction. For those who know enough about the Salton Sea also know that it's predominantly disadvantaged communities. Right? Well, when we modeled this from a techno-economic perspective, we recognized that you could potentially stand up 4 million tons of direct air capture in that area, which is not a trivial amount paired with that geothermal activity. But we think we missed something, right? And the point is that we need more layers when you start to think beyond the techno-economic picture On the left, again, you're looking at the geothermal activity, you're looking at the geothermal plants. On the right, this is from the EPA's EJ screening tool. And the EJ screening tool is, it's not perfect, but it is a good tool to kind of go through, and it will identify disadvantaged communities, communities that fall below thresholds in a number of criteria, health, income, et cetera. And what we can do is take those and overlay them, and you start to understand where you could be impacting disadvantaged communities, right? And when you start to think about the land requirement, right, we start to develop a little bit of a more narrow picture of siting here, right? And the land for direct air capture as a direct is manageable. When you start pairing this with low carbon sources of electricity, it can become substantial. So we can find where the communities are. We can find where and locate where disadvantaged communities exist. But where's the voice for the land? That's why we work with partners like the Nature Conservancy, which give the land that voice that it needs. Right. The truth is that consultancy is also a very important bird area. Might not be a good marriage with direct air capture facilities that have tremendous amount of surface area. Okay. So how do we think about land? One interesting approach is known as the power of place approach, again, developed by Nature Conservancy and applied out west. And what they did is they categorized the land into progressively less restrictive categories, starting with the legally protected, that category 1, national parks, wildlife refuges. You're not going to be placing anything there, right? Completely off limits, all the way through category 4, perhaps landscape intactness, wildlife corridors. It would be nice to keep those intact, but if we need to start anywhere, you start looking at that category 4 and you work your way back, right? And we may have the luxury as we start to scale to pick and locate in regions that minimize impact, but we may enter other tiers as we move down the line. Okay. So we put that all together and we see a new picture emerges here. Right? This was that same geothermal and nuclear DAC study that we had run, but we reanalyzed it considering now those protected lands. We reanalyzed it considering the demographics of where we're placing the technologies. You can think of the demographic index, 0%, really hitting none of the criteria established by that screening tool, to 100%. Your communities that hit all the criteria of a disadvantaged community for that tool. And you could see that there is an opportunity here to minimize impact in terms of your scale build out. Both in nuclear, we can avoid by staying to the left, those disadvantaged communities. In the geothermal picture, same. We have a lot of capacity build out that we can start in less impacted communities, and then we'll see what happens as we move forward, right? And as we learn. You'll see that geothermal picture. There is a little bit more impact we see in higher capacity in potentially impacted areas. So perhaps that warrants some iteration. And going back to that geothermal picture, right? We're looking at geothermal development here and where it is, pairing it with existing power facilities. But the truth is that you need about 150 C for geothermal to be viable for electricity. You only need about 80 to 100 C for direct air capture. That greatly broadens your siting flexibility, which can take you into regions, again, that avoid those types of impacts. Okay. Now, there's two problems with this picture, though we think it's a great start. The first is, though there are certainly local impacts, there are impacts throughout the value chain. All right. You're going to have clearly fence line impacts from the deployment of these technologies, right? One time in terms of that construction and that traffic and decommissioning of those facilities, but particularly ongoing that could be solvent drift into the atmosphere surrounding the facilities or degradation of the sorbents and the capture media. Now to mention the input and output of great amounts of materials from that facility. We also recognize extended impacts into the community and beyond when you think about the sourcing of materials. So perhaps the production and the mining of the materials for that capture media, and particularly the downstream carbon management, getting that carbon dioxide from that point of capture to a geological or responsible storage site that's been characterized. So that is certainly something we'll have to be mindful of as we're thinking through how to prioritize the location of these facilities. And the second issue is that I made an assumption here that we would treat that disadvantaged community as an exclusion zone without consulting that community, which is something that we've learned. There are not many benefits to direct air capture. We could go back to that carbon removal slide, and there are unique benefits to each technology. One of them is economic activity. And if we think it's responsible to go into these communities and have conversations with them, inform them and educate them on what are the benefits and risks to this and other technologies so that they can make informed decisions for what's best for those communities and their communities. So from that, we emerge into kind of a real world case study where we talk through, or I'm going to talk through our research out in Nevada. This has been a really fun and interesting study in combination with the Nature Conservancy, which I think having a partner like that who's on the ground and can relay those community concerns and set up those conversations is really critical to opening our doors and understanding how these solutions actually look on the ground. If you're interested in some of the results I'm going to talk through, there's, I think, some copies of this policy digest just outside the door here. And perhaps we could post a link for our online friends. So Nevada is one of several states that has a net zero pledge, right? I shouldn't say making the pledge is the easy part. I think you all want to join me in making a pledge to go net zero. I think it's probably, there could have been a lot of infighting to get to that point. The point is that actually achieving net zero requires a lot of careful planning in the early stages and understanding the implications of decisions that you make now on what that future might look like. And so we wanted to explore that realm of possibilities. As you can see here, their current policies set them at about 24 and 27% reductions in 2025 and 2030, well short of their goals of 28 and 45%. So we were called on to help Nature Conservancy team up and answer the question, how do you bridge that gap? And we didn't want to be prescriptive in that analysis really at all. So we developed a number of scenarios that really kind of spanned the baseline. We were aware there's a problem, but there's really no sense of urgency here, all the way to that best case. And I'll tell you, at the time of writing, we kind of designed this best case to be borderline fictitious. But things like 100% penetration of electric vehicles on the road, 100% penetration of heat pumps to replace natural gas water heaters in homes. We're seeing these policies being enacted in certain states today. So it's not so science fiction. Well, we thought still it was very aggressive or important to be ultra aggressive to see, again, once you have that reduction pillar in place, what do we need to do with removal to clean up the rest? Because again, we know it's resource intensive. We want to place the least amount of burden on that pillar as possible. And this is what we get. I'm going to bring your attention to the left most column here. You can see emissions in 2017, emissions in 2050. Will those grow in every state? Not necessarily. Nevada is a pretty interesting state. It has it's first most urbanized state in the country, has most federal land of any state in the country. But it also is projecting a pretty sizable population growth, which means there's going to be some economic growth and emissions that come with that. Right. And so unabated, we're looking at going in the absolute wrong direction. They'll maybe draw your attention to then the end members here. First, the baseline case where we're really doing next to nothing. We have reduced emissions relative to that 2050 by some amount. We'll be well short of those interim targets that they had established. But the key takeaway here is look at the amount of direct air capture we need, right? We've placed such an enormous emphasis on carbon removal when we take no action today, right? We're looking at 50 million tons of direct air capture, which is a lot for that state. It's a lot in general. When you compare it to the best case, that's 5 million. So the key takeaway there is, yeah, we've been super aggressive here in lowering emissions, but we still need DAC. And that borderline fictitious, I shouldn't say we still need DAC, we still need carbon removal. And I don't mean to say that they're interchangeable, right? I'm saying as a proxy. There's not a lot of nature-based solutions in Nevada. There are some though. And frankly, Nevada does not need to take on their own removal. They could actually license that to other states and regions. But we modeled direct air capture to see what that would look like from a resource perspective. Right? So 5 million, an order of magnitude, and we talked earlier about what that implicates in terms of scaling. So it's non-trivial. We also wanted to understand what that meant from a resource perspective. So a lot of those solutions, as you're probably well aware of, entail electrification of these technologies. So we wanted to understand what would be the amount of capacity build out and the land area associated with that. And interestingly, the most intensive electrification scenario is in the case where we did next to nothing today. And that's because of the vast amount of energy that direct air capture needs as a technology to meet that removal. 50 million tons of direct air capture that stress that places, right? So you're installing more electricity just to cover direct air capture. Again, goes back to the point I tried to make earlier on, placing all that burden on carbon removal and specifically technical carbon removal is a terrible idea, right? And I hope this kind of drives that point home. And we can see as we get into lower cases, that land area and that build out becomes more manageable. But how manageable is that? Well, we saw how we think about land in those tiers, right? And you can see those tiers here. This is the highest tier, right? That was that tier 1. These are these protected lands. All right, there's a no-go under any circumstance. This is tier 4, all the way down here. And what we recognize is that even across all our scenarios, we actually do have enough land that was categorized in that category 4 to build out, not just the electricity needs for carbon removal, but also for the decarbonized economy, which is great news, but it's an incomplete picture because it doesn't consider 2 important things. Well, really a third if you consider that DAC and some carbon removals will be tethered to certain entities. Thermal energy doesn't move well, electrons can't, right? And so if you're tethering direct air capture to a geothermal resource, you may not have the opportunity to select that land, right? What it also doesn't consider is the impacts from the electrification build out and the transmission infrastructure, as well as we've talked about it at length, the carbon capture and storage infrastructure downstream, right? And we can obviate a lot of that downstream capture by capturing it on site, right? We may be moving, instead of moving carbon dioxide from a point of capture, we may be moving reactive minerals and alkalinity to that site instead. This is an opportunity that could be a robust solution in Nevada, which has a tremendous amount of mining, right? And that mining is really interesting because mining, again, we talked about that Sherwood, you're processing a lot of unwanted and untargeted material, this gang material that we might be able to reuse if it has the proper chemistry, it has the proper alkalinity. In fact, a lot of our trips out to Nevada has been on this endless search for alkalinity in the state to see if we can't make that reaction work in these locations. Again, storing carbon in the form of carbonates on site. But if we can't achieve that, we can look at transporting it perhaps out of state, because frankly, and the story that's probably not told is that geological storage, as you might have seen back in our geothermal study, is not great in Nevada, right? You don't have deep saline, at least it's characterized. You have a few maybe ultramafic rocks, but not at the depth required for that we would need. So you're really looking at transporting that CO2 out of state, all right? And from a point source perspective, we have a cluster of activity down here by Vegas, right? Natural gas power plants, a little bit of industry in terms of cement and lime along the I-80 corridor. And so we have to think about perhaps what does that infrastructure build out look like with these point sources. And I like to think about not just what's going on in Nevada, but also in the context of its neighbors in the regional trend. Right? This is a wonderful analysis out of the Great Plains Institute that took, of course, point sources and rationalized a pipeline network to deliver that CO2 to reliable storage bases. It makes sense to use point sources, frankly, as the motivation there, because again, they can't move, at least existing plants. Now, there has been a lot of discussion about new industrial hubs that could be rationalized around storage basins, and I think that's a terrific idea. But you can see they did the old Midwest, oh, let me squeeze by you, when they examined Nevada, just kind of basically skipped it altogether. Now, again, there aren't a lot of point sources in Nevada, which might make sense. So, you know, you can see they're grabbing one natural gas facility here, and it looks like they want to pipe that into the Central Valley in California. I don't know how Central Valley feel about taking on CO2 from California, let alone other states, but that might be what we're looking at if we're talking about CO2 storage and carbon management in this type of deployment scenario. Okay, you might be able to take some of that CO2 from here and tap into this pipeline, but how does direct air capture kind of play into all that, right? If we start to develop that, there's really kind of two schools of thought as we're thinking about infrastructure and investing in that. Sort of the field of dreams approach. If you build it, they will come. If we know where these pipeline networks are and there's capacity and foresight to build them to accommodate capacity, you could align carbon removal along these transportation corridors to, again, minimize that impact. But again, where are those? What are the communities there? Have we included those voices? And are the other resources that we know are critical to making this economically and technically viable also co-aligned? So where do we go from? I think we can at least start with a few procedural recommendations. You know, it's important for us as chemical engineers to conduct really rigorous life cycle assessments of these technologies from cradle to grave to understand the true impacts, right? And as well as the benefits. And so maybe that extends also into social LCA of these technologies and how they impact communities, not only in the fence line, but in a distributed sense as well. And it's equally important that we communicate and disseminate that information to those communities, again, so that they can make informed decisions. These materials need to be accessible. We're not always great at communicating these kind of fine points of these removal technologies, particularly when it's such a nascent field as well, right? Developers ought to be conducting social and environmental impact assessments themselves prior to site selection so that they can also understand the potential impacts that the placement of those technologies could have on those communities. We also think it's really critical to engage communities early in that planning process and having conversations, particularly when it comes to perhaps establishing agreements that could confer equitable benefits back to that community. Okay. Finally, policy. Policy's already been doing a lot. We've talked about our friend Jennifer Wilcox. Oh, I think still good. Who's on service work at Department of Energy. A tremendous amount of investment that's coming in. We're seeing DAC hubs, hydrogen hubs, a lot of excitement around those ideas. Again, if you kind of cluster these and rationalize them regionally, then you can minimize those downstream impacts. Carbon negative shot, we've seen all arrows pointing towards $100 per ton, which will be very aggressive for some technologies like the engineered and the direct air capture that we're talking about, but not out of reach if we're thinking through 2050. We still need to get these deployed, and that's part of the early impetus to find the low-hanging fruit, find areas of minimal impact, and start learning by doing and sending them down their cost curves and learning curves, right? IRA, can't say enough about the tremendous boosts, particularly in incentives to deploy all these technologies. Kind of looking at that incentive gap and closing that is really critical to making a lot of these deployment and early and swift deployment manageable and realistic. We've seen Justice 40 initiative, really signed immediately by this administration, which redirects those benefits right back into those disadvantaged communities. But we can go further, I think, in encouraging those community engagements and agreements. There's not a one-to-one transfer of jobs from some sectors into the carbon removal sector and carbon management sector, but with proper training, I think we can make these jobs accessible, locally. To continue to support advanced RD&D, and particularly we talked about the Mrv, that measurement, reporting, and monitoring, reporting and verification, really, which again serves as a bottleneck, unfortunately, to some of these other removal technologies that we think are very promising. I'll close with this. It's a colleague, Roger Ains, the road to net zero is paved with hard problems. And I'd have to agree, I'm not claiming to have any answers here. I really am not. All I can assure you is that the way that we approach the problem was insufficient to capture the nuance, to tread carefully and understand how to do this responsibly. And we're hoping that as this new picture emerges, we'll be able to move toward more responsible deployment. The human capital that we need is also not there. Human capital that Department of Energy, what we're looking for, carbon engineers that aren't just strict engineers, but have an understanding of policy, to understand how many of these on the ground impacts may influence all the way back to the bench scale. It's really critical that next wave of human capital is emerging with that sort of hybrid knowledge. And these are a few of the brilliant people you'll be joining. We talked about Jen Wilcox, who really kind of spearheaded our lab, and we wish her well in her continued service work and all that she's doing there. A number of brilliant researchers. If you saw a map, it was probably Ellen back in the back that have contributed to our group. Our colleagues at WRI, which have just tremendous thought leaders in this space, and we thank them for their contributions in understanding environmental impacts and how to proceed responsibly. And you can't say enough about our colleagues at TNC Nevada, Jana, formerly John, Peter, and Tanya. This is the kind of partnership that we really welcome, and I think is really valuable to, again, understanding the true implications of our modeling. So that's all I have. Thank you for your attention. Oh, that's not all I have. I think I need to plug it. You didn't get enough or anything out of my talk. Frankly, there are some other resources. We do have a website there listed. And CDR Primer, this was an effort of a tremendous number of academics who came together to make an open source, recognizing that human capital and education on a number of topics, making sure that CDR is EJ centered, talking about things like life cycle impacts, geological storage, the implications of using carbon dioxide in lieu of storage. All those topics and the nuances there are recovered in that CDR primer, freely available. So we encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about the space, come see me or get reading. Now I'm done.
Thank you so much, Pete. I'm Nick Pevsner. I'm assistant professor in landscape architecture and regional planning here in the School of Design. And I can just start off with a couple of questions because so much of what you're describing is so interesting from a geospatial and just infrastructure planning point of view. But please, folks online, feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A function. And then we'll collect some questions here from the audience. So Pete, one question I had was, it sounds like you're integrating a lot of cautionary tales from a long history of infrastructure siting and maybe infrastructure bottlenecks from energy infrastructure and other kinds of infrastructure deployment processes. So what are some of the lessons learned that you're trying to preempt, before this industry really scales up and gets off the ground, to maybe streamline and avoid the kinds of bottlenecks we've seen around land use contestation in renewable energy, for example?
It's an excellent question. And I think, again, because such a large focus was on cost, things like the carbon negative shot, right? Really kind of, it was, and I think it's still, I talk about beyond techno-economics. That's not to say that techno-economics still doesn't make the world go round, and that is still an important focus. So it really is a continued understanding of how to find those low-hanging fruit opportunities, where I think we recognize that falls short is kind of getting on the ground and understanding where do the real barriers lie. Is it permitting? So why have we shifted to looking at carbonating of mine waste? Well, permitting of CO2 storage underground requires something known as a Class 6 permit, and Class 6 permits take a notoriously long time to get permitted. It's a tremendous amount of site characterization. It's kind of odd. If you want to inject oil, it's a Class 2 permit. You can get it done in a matter of days, right? You want a Class 6 permit, it's going to take, historically it's taken 18 months. If you're applying for primacy, which is a few states that have received primacy as a way for the EPA to place that burden and those resources back into the state's hands, which we think could expedite that application process takes a tremendous amount of time. And so what we're finding is that there are bottlenecks that we ought not exist in terms of that storage. Now, it's not to say that geological storage isn't still the end goal, but what can we do in the interim to perhaps avoid that? The other thing and we spent a lot of time on the downstream, you may have noticed that there's been some opposition to pipelines. And so there's a pipeline or bust mentality. And I remember back in 2015, when I first did my first industrial study, and my colleague Roger, I was presenting to my colleague at Livermore, Roger Ains, this idea of trucking CO2 in lieu of pipeline. And I thought it was just a throw-in because it's not economical. He cheered up because there was really recognizing that what was blocking a lot of the progress and projects on the ground was that the pipelines weren't going to go through. And so there is a really interesting trade-off there. When you look at scale, the economics of trucking kind of converge with pipeline at about 300,000 tons. And there are a whole lot of opportunities that exist below that where we might be able to truck, right? Now, that comes with environmental impacts as well, right? If maybe we could electrify trucks and take a different approach there. The communities that we talked about in Nevada welcome that. They welcome the economy that trucking brings into those communities that are really kind of, again, disadvantaged. One of the wild cards that we really think in terms of this space is rail. And how does rail play into this? Because rail is historically a bulk mover of commodities. And a lot of that movement has to do with coal. And IRA is a coal killer. And what we're going to see is potentially a tremendous amount of rail freight opportunity. And I think you recognize pipeline on that I-80 corridor. That's also where rail is cited, right? So these are converted lands. These are existing infrastructure. Right, and if we can leverage existing infrastructure, we can reallocate those funds elsewhere, right? And talk about minimize environmental impact by using existing infrastructure. It's not as simple as that, but we think it's interesting to explore that. Now, I'll say rail, we understand, is sort of a mess with this. It's got its own demons to work out right now with precision scheduled railroading and other mechanisms that we could get really deep into. But I think it's worth exploring where that opportunity exists, potentially also to salvage jobs in that industry.
Fabulous. So you're already kind of taking a very preemptively cautious approach that is recognizing environmental justice concerns, which I think has not been the traditional mode of industrial planning. And so that opens up a question of, can we get beyond the simple one-liner around carbon capture and actually start to differentiate based on technology and based on the actual system that is being talked about? So thinking about kind of major CO2 point sources that might be outfitted with carbon capture as one possible pathway, direct air capture as inherently distributed, but maybe actually more strategically citable because of that ability to be placed anywhere. Can we differentiate maybe some of the socio-political challenges of working with big emitters that may also be big polluters versus identifying big emitters that don't have the same kind of pollution burdens?
There's, I potentially heard a little bit of a moral hazard in there as well. If you know,
Feel free to explore that.
and it's a really valid point. You know, I think there's opposition to CCS. Perhaps you came today specifically out of that opposition. And I welcome that feedback. I think it's something we need to be honest about and take into account, that we're not enabling business as usual practices through the application of CCS and CDR. I think that applies specifically to oil and gas industry, right? And so there's some nuance there. It could take a long time to explore. There are social political realities. And I'm quite frankly torn. On one side, I recognize that there's a potential to enable business as usual. On the other side, I have a hard time saying that a fossil emitter or large emitter should go unabated on a result of that. And I don't think either is really a reason not to do CCS or CDR. I think it's a reason to do it very carefully and work with folks like the Kleinman Center to explore governance and design of policy to enact the proper guardrails to make sure that we're not locking anything in. Right? You know, there are some pros and cons. There's a tremendous amount of infrastructure, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge in that space. All right, but we have to keep our eye on the prize and kind of keeping carbon out of the atmosphere. So I recognize that, you know, it's a US-centric approach. I think if you talk to some folks, you know, more globally, you'll see some regions where that's a little bit more nuanced discussion.
Maybe finally from me, and then we'll open it up. And so get your questions ready, please. You know, what are some of the counterfactuals of these mining landscapes? If carbon capture is not deployed, there are existing legacy landscapes, and how does this new industry maybe open a new chapter?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, a lot of mining in abandoned mines and even active mines have legacy waste, right? And they can impact those local communities. So going after those resources, you obviously have some potential to remediate those sites. You know, maybe they could be characterized as brownfields. And in that case, IRA would even recognize higher incentives if you're going to target those regions. So there's that. There's also, you know, some mines have these very large stockpiles, which frankly give concern to the neighboring communities. So you think about even, you know, tailing storage ponds. These are, and when we were out there, and I don't want to give the name of the location of mine, but you know, we talked with a lot of the locals who were very concerned about the integrity of that waste storage on site. So it's an opportunity, not just, you know, when you're leveraging a waste product, you're really going after it because it's very low burden in terms of cost and carbon, but there are other benefits, I think, in doing that. A third opportunity that exists there that I think is really kind of a key, and my colleague Dan just gave a great kind of talk on this, is extraction of valuable critical minerals and other. So there's potential co-extractants from these mineral streams, and mining waste again generates. And we're after the alkalinity, but there could be other, you know, cobalt, nickel, other elements in there that are critical to our low energy future. So if there's an opportunity to leverage that extraction as well, and then you have a potential value add, and it can help with the economics, but it can also help us bring domestic critical mineral production, enhance that here. Yeah.
Fabulous. Does anyone have questions for Pete? Wait for the mic if you don't mind.
Thank you again so much for speaking today. This was incredibly fascinating. I know you talked a lot about policy and kind of socio-political considerations, but I would love to hear your take on, the role of private sector in building or making up the gap in R&D as well as financing for carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. And if you had any thoughts around promising trends or promising collaborations with private sector players.
Wonderful question. There is, and I would say in the last 18 months, we have seen an enormous flip and a really inflection point in the investment, specifically as CDR. Now, you could argue whether it's properly motivated or not. I think some people will sit on the side that we'll take the capital and standing a lot of these technologies up. It's corporate greenhouse gas inventorying and offsetting. So you've made a net zero claim, you're a company, you made it for a number of reasons, maybe stakeholder pressure, maybe you recognize there's some competitive advantage there. And we've seen a tremendous amount of that private capital now looking for not just removal, but quality removal, so that they operate on those 5 principles that we discussed, right? And so we're seeing that stand up even advanced markets, where basically we have demand well in advance. All of the carbon removal that's the vast majority is ex ante, right? It's being promised. There's some risk in that, right? It's not, but those companies that are able to take that private investment are able to stand up and promise those and raise, and again, learn by doing and scale. So we think that's really welcome investment into this space. And that applies across all approaches. And I think going forward, what we really need though over the next decade is really a government investment, because nothing really catalyzes that kind of private capital like government.
Question from an online viewer about scale. And right now, a lot of what you're talking about are these very large centralized or utility scale facilities. Is there a bias towards a large scale deployment, or are there opportunities for a more distributed or kind of decentralized scale of deployment for CCS?
It's a very interesting question. There are cost benefits to both approaches. If you're looking at creating jobs, a job potential, then you're going to want a distributed approach. Right? You're going to lose the economies of scale in terms of operating large facilities. Won't quite get you there. I think when you're looking at costing as well, some of the small scale modularized approaches, at least in the very interim, are going to be more expensive, right? Then these are modular small scale approaches tend to not scale up, they tend to scale out, right? And so you don't necessarily capture the economies of scale that you would in other industries. So I think that's the near-term advantage for these large facilities. There's also the question of why would you ever need to place a direct air capture facility near a community, right? And I think it's a valid question. I think the immediate answer to that is the co-benefit of economic activity, right? And if we can actually use CDR and carbon management deployment to actually help specifically communities that might be targeted in our transition, then that might be the answer to that question. I think the counter to that answer is, why don't we just take a few very specific regions of the world, particularly if you're talking about carbon removal, because you take a molecule of CO2 out of the atmosphere, it doesn't really matter where you're at, okay? And so you could rationalize very large scale. I've seen things like looking at Antarctica. I've seen looking at the middle of nowhere that say this is a region, the environmental impact, we're away from people, right? And we just sit up and we make these enormous carbon districts that can take. So I can see it both ways. I think it will be truly a mixture of the two approaches. I think there's going to be some advantage to that economic stimulus, but I think we're starting, as we do the analysis, to recognize that there are some regions, that lend to these types of really large hub opportunities, and we'll see. We're keeping fingers crossed that we'll see that announcement soon.
Thanks, Pete. That was this one. This is on. That was great. Hopefully just a quick, simple question, but you've said a couple times, you just said in your answer a little bit about the economic benefits of DAC in a community. And I'm wondering if you can spend a little time talking us through the breakdown of those economic benefits. And then also, if you're talking about those in terms of short term, like when these facilities are getting built, or whether you're looking at kind of the long-term economic benefits to a community.
Thanks, Corey. That's a great question. You know, I think it's primarily job creation. There could be, if you're in a storage, co-locating with storage, there could be some potential poor space royalties associated with storage, but it was predominantly going to be the economic employment opportunities at a direct air capture facility, for example. Rhodium Group did a wonderful analysis on this that proposed that, you know, there's going to be at least one-time or temporary up to 3,500 jobs associated with a 1 million ton plant. So it's pretty substantial, and then 280 ongoing. And so that's where we think the majority of that exists. But again, there's also, we saw there's distributed jobs that can occur kind of throughout that value chain. You talked a little bit about you know, trucking and bringing that economic activity to regions, potential rail and salvaging direct and indirect jobs in that sector. So and also, you know, mining. And so if there's legacy opportunities for carbon storage in those regions that we can use reuse a lot of those skill sets. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. You know, it's not there again, they're not always transferable jobs, which is why I kind of noted that, you know, training programs could be really important and impactful for those communities. But that's where we think the primary source of economic activity will come from.
This kind of connects to a question from one of the online viewers, but really kind of is, I think, connected to the suggestion of a much different approach to planning infrastructure than the one we currently have, right? This, what you're talking about is really calling for a major planning initiative almost at this kind of interstate scale. And so a question maybe of, is there a way of moving away from this kind of avoiding NIMBYism or avoiding negative externalities towards more of an opt-in process? And specifically, the question is asking about techno-economic opportunities around net zero neighborhoods. So what do you think about this idea of net zero neighborhoods that might actually be attractive and maybe interested in this industry, with the caveat that these kinds of partnerships would take time. It would need a kind of pipeline towards building trust. And are you aware of a kind of pipeline approach towards net zero neighborhoods?
Yeah, what an excellent question, and it's a really hard one to tackle. You know, it's we think about waste management in terms of physical waste. I think it's an easy problem to tackle. If you don't throw out your garbage, it will compile, it will stink, it will regurgitate. So we pay a fair amount. There's a direct and tangible benefit to remediating, you know, that type of waste. Carbon dioxide, invisible, taking carbon dioxide out of the air, or being part of a community that's part of that value chain. What is the direct benefit to you, right? A lot harder to tackle even when it might be obvious. So I think part of that is kind of, yeah, stepping back and communicating, running those kind of social LCAs, being able to communicate exactly what the benefits are, what those trade-offs are, you know, kind of talking with people, you know, getting into, you know, community meetings and planning meetings, and having them engage with planners, so that they're all kind of on the same page, opposing NIMBYism. I think also maybe perhaps design, right, of DAC facilities, right? I'd love to, you know, kind of incorporate them into a landscape. We were out in again, Nevada area, and there's you know, a humongous 130 megawatt wind farm out there. And you don't think necessarily wind farms are having a negative environmental impact, but it was located at the base of a national park and adjacent to a tribal cultural area. And so getting that right, understanding again part of the siting, but also communicating those benefits to those communities is so key. But I do think the communities can rally around economics. They can rally around the idea of these sort of local partnerships. And I think we're starting to see this. We see some of this in the Great Lakes region, where they're kind of teaming up to think about how it could become a carbon removal hub and how they could leverage that for local economies, right? And I think if you kind of maybe you know, are able to communicate those benefits in a way that doesn't kind of trigger a lot of that, you know, again, you know, there's some knee-jerk reactions to climate tech and those types of things. I think the better chance you have of getting that public acceptance. But I'm going to assure you that you're not going to get public acceptance by marching forward with projects without talking to those communities. I mean, that's just, again, and then talking about historically how we've done these things, particularly with tribal communities we talked to out there, is like, you know, where you consulted about the project and these pretending these communities don't exist, right? Not a plan for it.
So we had a question here, and then.
Hi. My question is more about the emissions itself. So we see renewable energy as like a new generation of like alternate source of energy, but at the same time, data centers across the world are generating more emissions. So there is sort of like another sort of source where like emissions are coming from. In the pandemic, for example, we saw that while transportation emissions must have gone down just because people can't travel to work, data centers are even growing exponentially because we need that sort of capacity to sort of hold down work from home or any sort of internet usage. So do you think that there, in terms of policy, do you think that there should be some sort of like baseline policies which sort of just generate like a do's and don'ts for like what kind of data centers can emerge and how much emissions they can actually produce, because ultimately they're emitting a lot of emissions itself.
Yeah, well, and you're talking a little bit about that economic leakage and leakage of emissions, I think, to other sectors. And you know, it's hard to single out any sort of industry in terms of, you know, I think maybe you're talking more generally in terms of maybe placing a carbon tax and progressive types of policies and cap and trade and subjecting all industries to those same metrics. You know, I do think those policies have been shown to be effective, and they could continue to be effective. I think in terms of addressing more specifically in data center, you know, in terms of, you know, PPAs or renewable energy is certainly one mechanism. And that, frankly, data centers generate a lot of heat, and because of that, they move a lot of air to cool that heat. Both of those things are really interesting from a direct air capture standpoint. And so, you know, taking a step back and saying, all right, well, we have a potential, you know, at least a momentary opportunity. What are the characteristics of integration here? Is there a pathway forward to sort of implement other technologies to help? Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Peak. Thank you for sharing. I learned a lot. I'm a Master of Environmental Studies student, concentrating in policy, which means I'm not a science guy, but I still want to learn something about CCUS techniques. So do you have any suggestion for our student without a solid science background to go deep into CCUS, that's like any materials, papers, and website for studies? Thank you.
Yeah, it's funny you ask. I got a cdrprimer.org right there. Free and open source. Also open door, open inbox. Happy to point you to some of our works and other resources for educating.
We take one in the back, one in the front.
Yeah, I just had a question about sort of, do you think there's a risk that sort of working on carbon capture and, you know, storage might take labor and resources and so on, talent away from like abatement and mitigation technologies? And what policies should we establish to sort of, as you've said, prioritize mitigation over carbon capture? Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take some away. Is it proportional to? I think we think about the share. Do you know what the investment in renewable energy versus CCS is today? It's significant. It could be on the order of 1,000 to 1. So yeah, I think it's okay to pour a little bit into CCS and CDR. I think there's plenty of resource to move forward. It's a valid question though, right? And I think it comes back to maybe Nick's moral hazard question, not getting priorities out of order, right? I think, again, the notion that, you know, rededication of resource where it might be more effectively used is a valid question, but the idea that we still need to scale and that these technologies are going to be called upon and then we need to be prepared. I think we're probably behind in terms of investment in those technologies. I think it's just, it all points at why we're here, is to do this responsibly and carefully, as that we can enact and design policies or guardrails if we find bad actors. And there are other, you know, ways to address that. But in terms of funding, I think we've got a lot. Frankly, I'd like to see more in MRV again for CCS and CDR, so that again we can assure that our projects are quality and that we're not putting, you know, questionable projects out there, and again enable a lot of those perhaps less energy intensive resources that won't compete with that renewable energy in the first place, like perhaps potentially ocean capture, that those can be viable going forward as well.
Right. I think we have time for one last question here in the front.
Thank you for the great talk. I have a question about MRV. It seems that the implementation of MRVs is non-trivial, right? Since there's various carbon capture technologies, either the single point storage or the transportation or the DSC, right? So measuring how much carbons you reduce and, you know, reporting that and verifying that, it seems like a complex task, because there's different types of machinery for each of these processes, right? And the probably industrial protocol that comes from the OEMs for each of these machinery is different as well, maybe even proprietary, right? So the implementation of this MRV, which, you know, if you implement it more rigorously, will be vital for the correctness of these projects. It seems that it could benefit from a software solution, right? A solution that integrates various of these protocols together and streamlines MRVs across different types of carbon capture and carbon technologies. Is there any human capital that is being invested into such software solutions, or is that on the radar, or is this too far down the road?
Software AI could be really powerful agent here. You talk about crux MRV. There are no standards, right? So there is a lot of human capital dedicated to understanding all those nuances and intricacies and developing standards that can be applied, so we can make these the comparison of technologies more apples to apples, and understand, again, getting back to that quality removal and avoidance. I think when, you know, the management and the assessment of the carbon, you know, you can break that down upstream, you know, ongoing, downstream. There's still a lot of science to be done in terms of, particularly when you look at, you know, kind of nature-based solutions. It doesn't go without saying that the kind of the engineered realm of removal, you know, particularly energy usage, particularly in leakage of emissions and implications thereof. You know, AI software, I think, could be tremendously helpful there. I'm not necessarily sure. There are certainly some life cycle accounting platforms that you can use. There are emission factors that are constantly updated, so that you're aware of kind of maybe grid intensity. You know, but there's, you know, the actual kind of ensuring that this is also long-term. I think that's where a lot of the challenge comes in. We're seeing a lot of software in remote sensing too, right? Which is really, really critical if you're developing these projects in other areas of the world, so that you can do that and take kind of resolution from satellites and kind of understand the kind of imagery you're looking at and be able to kind of convert those into, right? So I think the combination of those types of efforts can really move us forward. Human capital really needed in that space. So
Great. I think that's all the time we have. So Angela, to you.
Thank you, Pete and Nick, for this conversation. I think we all learn a lot. I mean, this is a topic that is evolving. And so I encourage you to read the CDR primer and obviously to follow up if you have questions. We are going to have more events, and there are more policy digest and publications coming from the center. So I encourage you to register to our newsletter to be aware of those. Thank you, Nick. And I hope you follow all these Climate Week events that are coming all this week. We were very lucky to have this, I think it was the second one of the week. So I hope you can attend all of those. We're going to have a lecture in November here at the Kleinman Forum about geoengineering with our visiting scholar, Shushi Talati. So please check our website, our event page, where to learn more about this technology. And I think that's it. Thank you so much. There's lunch outside for you to grab.
Yeah, thank you all for your questions here and online. Thank you, Pete, so much, and good luck with the work. A few good ones.